This chapter will be covering neurocognitive disorders, which are neurologically based disorders that interfere with our ability to think or perceive. All neurocognitive disorders involve the same thing. Basically, that's a compromised brain function. It might be permanent, it might be temporary, but the brain is simply not functioning properly. We're going to talk about three different neurocognitive disorders: delirium and major and mild neurocognitive disorders. Mild neurocognitive disorder is a new disorder introduced in DSM-5. Now, a person's brain can be compromised at any age, and there are many different things that can cause the compromise of one's brain. Disease, injury, tumor, stroke, those are all fairly common. But drugs and toxins can also lead to compromised brain functioning. We've actually talked about that in the past. Mercury and lead, for example, can lead to compromised brain functioning and intellectual dysfunction in children who are exposed to those toxins. There often is also psychological impairment as well as cognitive impairment. There are several examples that are listed here. We're going to talk about them briefly at various points in this lecture. When the brain is compromised, you can get some pretty bizarre, or what seem to be pretty bizarre, syndromes. The neglect syndrome, for example, in this case due to a damage to the right parietal lobe. So when you ask someone to draw a clock, their clock only has numbers on the right side. There are no numbers on the left side. Even when they draw a plant, a flower in this case, the flower only is on the right side and the leaves are only on the right side. It's as if half the world doesn't exist. It's being neglected. Again, it seems impossible that you could get symptoms like that, but in fact symptoms like that are fairly common with certain kinds of brain damage. Now, neurocognitive disorders can affect learning, they can affect memory, they can even affect our sense of consciousness and awareness of the world around us. This disorder, unlike the disorders that we've been talking about, is far more common in people who are older, although it is possible to have neurocognitive disorders at any age. Again, we're going to be talking about three classes: delirium, which comes on very quickly and is often something that can be treated and reversed, and then mild and major neurocognitive disorders, basically dementia, which is slow in terms of development, but irreversible. Since these are disorders primarily of aging, I want to start by addressing some myths about aging. Many people think that older people are fragile, that they just are barely holding on, that they don't handle things very well. Actually, the research shows just the opposite. Many older people handle stress very well because they look at the stressor and they say, been there, done that. They typically have, if anything, fewer anxiety and mood fluctuations. Now, even though the mood fluctuations are not elevated, you may remember that older white males tend to have very high rates of suicide, largely because they're isolated. We see less substance abuse in older adults, although sometimes they will be taking a large number of medications, and some doctors overprescribe the medications because they don't realize that the removal of the medication from the system, the breakdown of that medication, is slower in older individuals. Quite frankly, one of the reasons why there are fewer substance abuse problems in older people is Anyone who abuses substances usually doesn't make it to old age. And psychotic disorders are actually less common. Generally speaking, if the individual has planned carefully so that they have reasonable financial security and meaningful activities and a support group, most older people are actually happier. And despite the medical problems that come with aging, they actually have very satisfying lives. Let's start with delirium, which is often confused with dementia. They are entirely different. In delirium, we have dramatic, very fast onset symptoms. The person's confused. They don't have any idea where they are. They can't think clearly. They may have perceptual distortions that are so dramatic that they simply can't function. They may not be able to form memories at all. It's like extreme dementia, but it came on in a matter of minutes or hours. There may even be psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations. We'll talk about what causes them in just a minute, but you won't miss these symptoms. They're not subtle. They come on so quickly that the change is frightening. And when you see delirium, you need to get the individual to the ER as soon as possible. It may be best to just put them in the front seat of the car and drive them there, because whatever is causing the symptoms usually can be identified and reversed with prompt treatment. But if you don't get prompt treatment, you may have some long-term damage. Now, this is far more common in older people, but it'll also occur sometimes in children. Children, for example, do not have the body regulation that adults tend to have. So they get sick and they might run a fever of 105. Fevers of 105 can do brain damage, but they will immediately lead to dramatic neurocognitive symptoms in people of any age, including a 5-year-old. By far, the most common cause of delirium is some sort of metabolic disturbance that can lead to high fever or electrolyte imbalance, and as a result, affect the functioning of the brain. Substance abuse or substance withdrawal can also do that in younger people as well as older people, and severe vitamin deficiencies may also affect functioning. In younger people, the more common cause of delirium is a head injury. And again, it may be somewhat delayed, but will show a very rapid onset. For example, if you hit your head hard in a traffic accident, what happens is your head hits something. But just like the passengers in a car who aren't wearing a seatbelt, when the car hits something, they keep going. The brain inside the skull keeps going when you get hit, and it bounces against the wall of the brain, the skull, and then bounces back and forth. The brain is roughly the consistency of a thick gelatin. So this bouncing back and forth can be very dramatic, and it can rip the blood vessels that feed the outside surface of the brain. We call that the dura, and you can develop a bleed called a subdural hematoma. Now, you'll know that you've been hit in the head, and you may have some scars on the outside of your skin from the injury. But you think you're all right because except for a headache, you're fine. But as that bleeding continues, there's no place for the blood to go. So what it does is it pools and it becomes more and more powerful and it pushes against the brain. And at some point does it to the point that the brain isn't functioning. That's when you see the delirium. Now, if you recognize it immediately, you go straight to the ER. They'll recognize very quickly what's going on. They'll do a quick CAT scan and they'll know exactly where it is. And they'll drill a hole into your head and allow the blood to escape therefore relieving the pressure. If you do that fast enough, there'll be no long-term damage. But if you don't, if you ignore it, not only can you have long-term brain damage from that pressure, but depending on its location and intensity, it could even lead to death. So the rule of thumb with delirium is most of the problems that create delirium are things that can be corrected if you seek medical attention quickly. Now, you can get delirium from various substances that can intoxicate you. Often, if the substances dissipate, the delirium will go away. The concern that we have from such substances in older people is that, one, older people often are on many medications because as you get older, you have more health problems, including chronic health problems that need to be managed. And two, as you get older, the dosage needs to be reduced for most common medications. Not all doctors are aware of that, and so oftentimes older individuals not only will be on multiple medications, but too high a dose of the medications, and that can lead to intoxication, delirium. In most cases, treatment is easy if you are in a medical center where they have the ability to evaluate your situation and take action. If you're running a very high fever, in a matter of an hour, they can bring that fever down with a combination of drugs like Tylenol or cooling vests that will remove the excess heat. If you are older, you are likely to have multiple health problems that are going to prevent you from maintaining the homeostasis that is so important to a healthy body. However, if you know what the problems are, if you know how to monitor them, if you know when to seek help before things get completely out of whack, you can usually prevent many of these situations. Again, you need to see the doctor. The doctor needs to communicate with you, and you need to listen to what the doctor says. Unlike delirium, which is almost impossible to miss, because in delirium the symptoms come on very rapidly and they are very dramatic. In dementia, the symptoms come on so slowly that often the symptoms become quite severe before you really notice it. In fact, a very common situation is a person is diagnosed with dementia, and the people who know that person well will realize, oh, that explains this and this and this, all of which have been going on for a while, and all of which were kind of ignored because, well, it wasn't a very big change. Dementia is the result of brain damage. When the brain is damaged, it cannot repair itself. We don't grow new neurons. And most forms of dementias are the result of diseases that gradually kill brain cells at a much faster rate than they would normally die. The result are symptoms such as memory impairment. Now, the memory impairment tends to be for recent memories, so someone with dementia may not realize that the story they're telling you right now, they've told you twice in the last 30 minutes. But they will remember things from 40 years ago. So the really long-term memory, they tend to be able to handle better than the relatively recent memory. They may have difficulty with language, which is called aphasia, or difficulty carrying out basic tasks, which is called apraxia. Let me give you an example. This is a key. Now you know what a key is and you know what to do. If I handed this to you and asked you what you would do, you would tell me that you put it in a lock and you turn it. What could be simpler? But when you have an apraxia, you might look at that key and be completely puzzled about what it is and what you're supposed to do with it. Agnosia refers to sensory deficits, the ability to process sensory information. And then you can also find what is called executive function deficits. Executive function refers to putting a lot of tasks together to accomplish a much larger task. In fact, almost everything we do every day involves executive functioning. So we need to go to the grocery store and pick up a loaf of bread. Sounds simple, but there's 100 things you have to do to go to the grocery store. You need to grab your keys. You need to go out to the car. You need to start the car. You need to back it up. You need to navigate to where you want to go. All the time you need to remember why you're doing all of that. And then when you get to the store, you need to go and find the bread, and then go and pay for the bread, and then take the bread out, etc. You could break that down into dozens or even hundreds of subtasks. If 5 minutes into the task you don't remember what you're doing or why you're doing it, something as simple as buying a loaf of bread becomes impossible. By the way, dementia can hit anyone. You may recognize Ronald Reagan, former president of the United States. He suffered from Alzheimer's, one of the leading causes of dementia, and for the better part of 10 years, the last 10 years of his life, was pretty much isolated because of the symptoms of dementia. The DSM has renamed the diagnosis of dementia as major neurocognitive disorder, and it added another disorder called mild neurocognitive disorder. Now, frankly, I doubt there are very many doctors who go around saying, okay, you have major neurocognitive disorder. They're more likely to say you have dementia, because that's a term that we've been using for many, many decades. What you have with dementia is a gradual deterioration in brain function because of a gradual loss, but a much more rapid loss than you would normally find, in the number of functioning neurons. Now, your neurons have been dying since you were about 3 months old, and they continue to die every single day. But fortunately, the way our brain is wired, you see very little decline because the interconnection of the neurons makes them very stable in terms of their functioning, even as cells die off. Actually, the principle is very similar to the principle behind the internet. By having signals that can go almost anywhere to get to the eventual location, it's almost impossible to wipe out the internet, say in time of warfare. As a result, you see the major symptoms that we've been talking about: memory, judgment, language. In mild neurocognitive disorder, you see this at a much lower level. The belief is, and there's reason to suspect this belief is accurate, that mild neurocognitive disorder represents an early stage of major neurocognitive disorder. There's nothing that we can do to reverse a neurocognitive disorder. All we can do is slow that process down. So if we detect it earlier, the idea of having the diagnosis of mild neurocognitive disorder is that that's an effort to detect it earlier, and we slow it down, the person may never develop major neurocognitive disorder. Now, this next part you may find a little frustrating and perhaps upsetting. But the fact is, these don't happen in young people generally. They happen in people that are old. And older people tend to die. So, if you slow down a dementia process 3 or 4 years just by doing some treatment earlier on, the odds are very good that the individual will die of natural causes before they ever experience the major neurocognitive disorder. Now, some of you will find that upsetting. Okay, well, we're just hoping they'll die before it happens. If you have a family member who has Alzheimer's and you watch that process and you see how they suffer in the early stages and how much their loved ones suffer in the later stages, being able to prevent those disorders by slowing them down enough that the person dies of natural causes before they happen, that's a big deal. It's a very big deal.